and that is by Professor Gopal Patel, who will speak on Hindu perspective in addressing the global environmental crisis. So Mr. Gopal Patel is an environmental activist, founder and director of Bhumi Global. I will just briefly introduce about him. Gopal D. Patel uh, is a faith-based environmental activist, campaigner, and consultant for over 10 years, working in India, East Africa, Europe, and North America. He is co-founder and director of Bhumi Global, a non-profit organization that works to educate and mobilize Hindu communities globally for environmental action. He currently serves as co-chair of UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council and is a member of advisory board to the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Born and raised in England, he currently lives in New York City area, metro city area. Thank you. Over to Professor Gopal Patel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niyati Joshi. Thank you, Ramesh ji, and everyone for having me. I know it's very late for you in India. It's still early morning here in New York. So good morning from New York. And I know also that we're running a little bit over time. So I'll try to keep my remarks as short as possible and see if we can have some discussion as well. And it's great to go after Dayananda ji, who is a real inspiration and mentor in this space of Vaishnavism and culture and how to address the global environmental crisis. My talk is going to be a little bit more focused from a global perspective and a little bit more focused on the policy aspects of the environmental crisis and what Hinduism can bring to global policy. I'm going to share my screen, so let me see if I can get that up and running. Okay, and then great. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. So the title of my talk is Hindu Perspectives in Addressing the Global Environmental Crisis. And as was mentioned, I serve as the founder and director of Bhumi Global, a global Hindu environmental organization. And we also do a lot of work at the United Nations, advising the UN on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as Gaurangaji was talking about earlier. And we're also on the advisory board for the new UN program called the Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is being launched by the UN on World Environment Day, which is on June 5th. But obviously today we are celebrating World Biological Diversity Day. So happy Biodiversity Day to all of you. Let's get this show on the road. Okay, so in terms of the work, just to explain a little bit more about who we are and what we do, Bhumi Global has been working now for over 10 years. And we are an international network of Hindu temples and communities and leaders. And what we try to do is bring a Hindu perspective or Hindu perspectives to environmental concerns. And we do that through educating people, engaging them and empowering them for environmental action. Our work is focused on action, but we work at a large cross section from grassroots activism all the way up to policy at the United Nations level. And I just wanted to pause a little bit because we've been talking about the environmental crisis and sustainability, and I wanted to share as a reminder, as I'm sure all of us already know, what is the environmental crisis that we are facing right now. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, they frame the environmental crisis under three categories: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Now, obviously, these three areas are distinct in their own right, but there's also significant overlap between the three of them as well. So if we just briefly go into what each of these are. So for climate change, we know climate change is what is more commonly known as global warming, the burning of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide being trapped in the Earth's atmosphere, and therefore the planet heating. And it's a crisis right now because the planet is heating far too quickly and it's not cooling down quickly enough. And therefore we are significantly off track to meet the Paris climate targets, which was set in 2015. We're off base to meet those by a significant amount. And so there's a real crisis going on right now when it comes to how warm the planet is getting over such a short period of time. The next crisis is the biodiversity crisis. And as I mentioned, we were celebrating World Biodiversity Day today. And biodiversity loss is something which we do not maybe see or experience on a day-to-day basis, but it's something that's going on significantly behind the scenes. So for example, within nature, there is a natural rate of extinction amongst species and biodiversity. And at the moment, what we're seeing is like between 100 to 1,000 times more the natural rate of extinction in the natural world. A recent report that came out, I think it was earlier this year, by the World Wildlife Fund, showed that since 1970, there has been a 2/3 decline in biodiversity across the world. And if you look in various parts of the world, you'll see different things. For example, in North America, billions of birds have been killed or died over the last 50 years. In Latin America and the Caribbean, 95% of biodiversity has been lost there. And so biodiversity loss is essentially the fabric of our world and what underpins all of our societies and all of our lives. And it's literally dying. And it's a major, major issue coupled with climate change. And then pollution, as those of us who are living in India and specifically in the cities of India, we may be experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Air pollution, water pollution, other kinds of pollution are very damaging for the natural world, but also for human health. And we see, according to the World Health Organization, that over 7 million people every year die of air pollution across the world. And I think India currently maybe has 7 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world. So that's definitely a crisis. And you're seeing now that the air pollution crisis is not just affecting countries like India and China, but also affecting countries like the United Kingdom. Last year, there was the first recorded case of a young girl in London dying of air pollution. That was the first ever time that has been attributed to someone's death in the UK. So air pollution is a global concern, as is water pollution as well. And these are the 3 main categories according to the UN, but we know there are other environmental crises as well. Again, talking to India, we know the water crisis is very acute in India. We know that India is going to significantly struggle to have enough water for its population by 2030. We're already seeing in India cities being stretched with their water supply, specifically Bangalore. I think last year was very water stressed. And again, that's a global issue. Cape Town had a major issue with water a couple of years ago as well. So there are a myriad number of environmental crises all coming to a head at the same point. And it is overwhelming. And it is right and it is important that religious, spiritual, cultural institutions look at these issues and see what we can do to address them. And as we are talking about faith and spirituality, I thought it would be important to look at the history a little bit about how we got to where we are right now. We can, yes, it's a result of technology, it's a result of greed, it's a result of overconsumption, as previous speakers have been talking about. But in many ways, where did those ideas take root in the world? And specifically, where did those ideas take root in the Western world? And historians, environmentalists, in many ways point to 2 moments in history. The first is probably more commonly known, the Industrial Revolution, which started where I grew up in the United Kingdom in the late 1800s. And the Industrial Revolution was really the starting point where fossil fuels became the main source of energy. And we know that fossil fuels are the main cause of climate change. And so the Industrial Revolution, that marker from the late 1800s onwards, is the point by which climate scientists measure the increase in global temperatures. And so the Industrial Revolution, for those who are interested in the history of the environment, is a point to look at. What is a little bit less known, but is getting more awareness around, is the arrival of Christopher Columbus to the Americas, coupled with what was called the Doctrine of Discovery, or the Papal Bull of 1493. Those moments combined marked a significant shift in global history. Specifically, Columbus's arrival showed that there was a new world, so to speak, to be conquered. And that conquer of the Western world, or of the Americas, was facilitated by this understanding of the Doctrine of Discovery issued by the Catholic Church and the Pope at the time. And essentially what the Doctrine of Discovery said was that Christians are allowed to colonize and take over any part of the world that a previous Christian has not laid claim to. So what that resulted in was a significant number of Christian missionaries coming to the Americas to literally take over North America, Central and South America. And in doing so, as we've been talking about earlier today, really destroy indigenous wisdom, indigenous culture, traditional understandings of land management, of forestry, of agriculture, of animal husbandry. All of those things were wiped out to a significant level, and replaced by, in many ways, a technological, like a framework which really separated humans with the land. And so these two moments are important. And I want to raise those up because I think we just focus on the technology and the policies and so on like that. But I think it's important to understand where the roots of the crisis actually come from. So what are the global religious organizations and traditions doing right now, and what is happening on a global level to address the crisis? Again, many of you will be familiar with some of these efforts that are listed on the screen, but you see specifically where I do a lot of my work at the United Nations level, you see a major move in the UN and associated institutions to engage very strongly with religious organizations. And so you have within the UN Environment Program, you have a religion program called Faith for Earth, which is a major initiative. You have also the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative at UNEP, which is working with indigenous leaders and religious leaders in different countries to address tropical rainforest deforestation. You also see faith-based engagement around the different UN processes and the UN negotiations when it comes to climate change, biodiversity, and other environmental issues as well. And the United Nations itself, I think it was in 2009, said that when the religions come together and work on environmental issues, it's the largest civil society movement in history. And so there's a great upswell going on right now of people of all religious traditions stepping up to address the environmental crisis. And obviously we're here to talk about what Hinduism can offer to that. So I want to focus on two things. The first is that in order to engage with the issues, what our organization really focuses on, and what we really try to encourage other Hindu organizations to do, is to understand and develop a Hindu framework of engagement. Because every religious tradition has an understanding of not just what it means to be a person in the world, and what is my relationship with the earth, what is my relationship with my community, what is my relationship with God. Every religious tradition has that. But what also every religious tradition has is, that's the more in the theology, it's more in the social teaching in terms of how should I act? How should I be a good person? How should I take care of myself? How should I take care of others? And also, how do we change things in the world so they are better, right? And I think that's the crux of what we're talking about today is we're in a crisis. How do we make things better? And I want to offer what we often in our organization do with the Hindu groups we work with is offer a framework for how to engage Hindus. And one of the key things we do, and we take this from, we see a lack of this in the mainstream environmental movement, is that we offer various on-ramps. We see oftentimes in the modern world that we think there's only one solution to a very complex problem. And we know that a complex problem requires a complex solution. We can't, to simplify it means we miss out the nuance and we don't bring everyone on the journey with us. And so we take inspiration from the Bhagavad Gita in chapter 12, where Krishna gives Arjun various options. He says, if you can't do this, do this. If you can't worship me like this, worship me like that. If you can't worship me like that, then do it like that. If you can't do it like that, do it like this. And he offers Arjun different on-ramps so that Arjun feels like at least he can do something. And I think that's so important in the environmental context that we're talking about, that everybody feels like they have a contribution to make. And the Bhagavad Gita talks about that specifically. Ultimately it gives one teaching, but it gives Arjun different options. Krishna gives Arjun options. And those options are very, very important when we're talking about social change and addressing the environmental crisis. The second thing, again, taking from the Bhagavad Gita, is that Krishna teaches Arjun according to Arjun's capacity to understand and his ability to digest what Krishna is talking about. And most importantly, as you progress through the Bhagavad Gita, you see Krishna imparts knowledge onto Arjun because Arjun is willing to learn. And I think this is also so important in the environmental movement, because we will find people who do not want to learn, or we'll find people who are unable to understand or do not want to understand, or for various reasons. Everybody is at a different part in their life journey. And we need to develop the messaging and the outreach according to where people are and where people can understand. And again, that's a beautiful lesson from the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna educates Arjun based on where Arjun is in terms of his consciousness and his understanding about what he should be doing in the world. And then another part of the framing, which I think is really important, that comes out of the Bhagavad Gita, is the concept of personal responsibility. And this is in many ways the beauty of the Bhagavad Gita, which can be applied to all spheres of life, not just the environmental crisis, which is that Krishna teaches Arjun and gives Arjun options and teaches him throughout the whole text. And then right at the end, in this very famous verse, 1863, Krishna says to Arjun, essentially, I have told you everything you need to know, but you need to make the decision about what is right for you. And what that does, it puts the responsibility onto Arjun. And we all know that in our lives, when we take personal responsibility for something, we are much more invested in that activity. You know, oftentimes, if we are told to do something from someone and we don't have the personal conviction, it can be very hard to live out that teaching. But if we have internalized and made that decision for ourselves to change or do something in a different way, we are going to be much more invested to make sure we're a success in doing that. And so the Bhagavad Gita places significant emphasis on that personal responsibility, that Krishna is a friend. He is offering all the advice, education, and resources that Arjun could need. But ultimately, Arjun needs to make the decision for himself what he needs to do. And I think for all of us who are, whether we're religious leaders or activists or educators or homemakers, we all have to find out what is our personal responsibility to the environment and what can we do to make the world more environmentally friendly. And broadly speaking, this is what it's called in activism and in the social change. It's called a theory of change, which is essentially, and in your own time, you can look into theories of change, but look into how do we move a group of people or an individual from one point in their life to another? How do we get someone who's not an environmental activist to start caring about the environment? How do we take a business that doesn't think it needs to be sustainable to becoming more sustainable? What does that journey look like? What are the levers? What are the pressure points in order to get someone from A to B? And that's called a theory of change. And I want to suggest that the Bhagavad Gita offers a significant framework for a Hindu theory of change or a Vaishnav theory of change. And I really suggest that we try to, in our work, try to really understand what that is so we can bring more people onto this journey. I want to talk a little bit now about Hindu opportunities to engage, because today we've heard about culture, which is very important. We've heard about theology and philosophy, which is very important as well. as I said, a lot of the work I do with Hindu groups is around policy. And what we see in many ways, as I said earlier, is that the environmental crisis is a complex issue. It's not straightforward. There are no easy solutions. And I compare it oftentimes to, in the history of the world, issues around slavery or colonialism. For example, the British rule of India. There wasn't, in many ways, there was a simple solution to getting rid of the British, but at the same time, it was complex. It was difficult. It took many years, hundreds, generations of people to eventually get to the point where India became an independent state, an independent country. And so the environmental crisis, we really believe, although at its heart, the solution is simple. The solution is a spiritual solution. The solution is a values-based solution. But because of the complexity and the interconnected nature of the world, we need to be able to apply our simple solutions to the complex issues. And so here I've just listed a few things which, in the realm of environmental policy and negotiations, governments and bureaucrats and business leaders and other kinds of organizations are looking at. And I list these because if we want to really meaningfully engage and address the environmental crisis, we have to look at how it's impacting so many spheres of our lives. And so, for example, if we look at the first two issues here of economics, finance, and business, most of our businesses right now are not sustainable, are not environmentally friendly, right? So how do we reform the business sector? How do we reform capitalism? How do we reform the understanding, as Dayanandaji was saying, that success at advanced countries means more money, when actually the most advanced countries are the ones that get by with minimum harm to the natural world. So we need to look at issues like GDP, of growth-based capitalism and all these things, and see, what does Hinduism have to say around business? What does Hinduism have to say around the current economic models that the world currently operates on? Another issue is human rights and dignity, and I'm going to couple that with human migration and refugees. We know that because of climate change and the biodiversity crisis, that human civilization is going to go under rapid transformation in a very short period of time. And you're going to see mass migration of people because they're going to be moving from countries where they can no longer live. And I'll just use the example of Bangladesh very briefly. In Bangladesh, by 2050, there'll be 18 million people who will be internally displaced or internally moving in Bangladesh because they will no longer be able to live there, right? So Bangladesh obviously is on the border of India. So what is going to happen to those 18 million refugees from Bangladesh? Where are they going to go, right? Because they will no longer be able to live in Bangladesh. They're going to have to move somewhere. And that's just one country. And you look at the Middle East, even here in the United States, you see people in the United States having to move from certain parts of the country because they can no longer live where they are because of climate change. What does Hinduism have to say about that? What from our Hindu Vaishnav theology and philosophy do we have to say about the rights of an individual, the dignity of an individual, the fact that people are going to be on the move in mass over the next 50 to 80 years? It's a huge issue. Loss and damage, divest, invest. These are very technical things in the environmental movement. You can go out and do your own research into that. But my point here is that for us as Hindu communities and Hindu leaders to make an impact, it's important to look at the theology, philosophy for sure. It's important to look at the culture. It's also important to look at the activities and how we're living. But it's also important to look at the policies as well that underpin the current global order and underpin the environmental crisis, and see how we can reform those policies from a Hindu lens, from a Hindu perspective. I think that's one of the key things the Hindu community really needs to lean into in the coming years. I'm just going to finish with a final example. The UN are having the Food Systems Summit in September. And this is to give you an example of what I mean to lean into the complexities, is that when we talk about food, we think food is very simple. But actually, if you break down our global food systems, they are very, very complex. And so the Food Systems Summit that the UN are organizing in September are looking at food through 5 different lenses or action tracks. And you'll see them on the screen here. So it's not just about getting good food, but it's about making sure the food is safe and nutritious, making sure the food is used using sustainability or sustainable consumption patterns, making sure it's nature positive, making sure that those who produce the food have equitable livelihoods, making sure that our food systems are vulnerable, are resilient to vulnerability, shocks, and stress. So it's not just about, let's just make sure everybody eats well, but actually, in order for everybody to eat well, there's a complex system globally behind the scenes that needs to be reformed so that we get good, nutritious, healthy, environmentally friendly food on our table. So this is just one example of food. If we look at any other environmental issue, behind the scenes, there are immense complexities there. And Hinduism has the depth, has the wisdom, has the history to speak to these complexities. And I think that's the opportunity and the challenge for Hinduism, not just in India, but in the world as well, to speak and engage with the complexities of the world. So I'll stop there and I'll hopefully have some time for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the floor is open for the questions. Many people do not see spirituality being connected environmental concerns. Do you face any public resistance in your work as you combine religion, spirituality, and environmentalism?
Very good question. Thank you. Is it Vanshika? Do we face any resistance? Actually, no. On the outset, there's no resistance to the idea. The resistance oftentimes, though, is when non-religious people, policymakers, governments, and businesses, when they think that the solutions that the religions are offering are too simplistic, when they see that we're not engaging, as I was talking about, with the actual issues and the complexities on the ground. So let me give you an example. We may, and in the realm of policy, we may say everyone should go vegetarian, right? And that's an admirable aim. And if everyone in the world did go vegetarian, we would significantly address the environmental crisis. But we know that for everyone to go vegetarian is not an easy thing to do. There are social, cultural, economic factors for people to go vegetarian. And so for us to be taken credible, we have to go beyond the talking points of saying everyone should do this or everyone should believe that, but actually go into the details, be like, okay, well, why are people not being vegetarian? Why are people not having access to good fruits and vegetables? And I think that's where the pushback comes from governments and businesses, is when the religious, spiritual talking points are too simplistic and not engaging with the ground reality.
Now we have another very interesting question. Sir, is not finding business in Hinduism culture a morally incorrect step?
I would say, my understanding that in Hinduism, you have dharma, artha, karma, moksha. You have various pursuits that one has to go through. And artha is the pursuit of business, is the pursuit of money. We need money to survive in the world. That's just a reality. And money is made through business. And so therefore, we need to think about, in the traditional times, we had an understanding of what artha meant. We had an understanding of what a moral framework was for generating income. But unfortunately, we are not, in most parts of the world, we are not using a moral framework for our business. We are using just economic factors, right? And so I don't think it's, as was suggested here, a morally incorrect step. It's just that we have to find out ways to build our businesses to generate income. And just for example, any Hindu organization is generating income. ISKCON generates income. You can't dress the murtis, you can't, feed people prasadam unless you're generating some income, So like, what's the framework for that income generation? And also, who is giving that money? Are we taking money from people who are engaged in fossil fuel industries? Are we taking money from people who are engaged in the plastics industries, which is very damaging, and so on like that? And so we really need to think through the moral framework about how we generate and receive money to do our work, either as a religious organization or as a private individual.
Yes. We have one more question we can take.
Sure.
Though we have no many research paper and programs that are going on, the situation is still the same and going worse. So how can we make research work into proper?
The question is like so let me read this question. We have so many research programs are going on and the situation is still the same. I think part of the challenge is that, the opportunity is that you're right, the research is there. And so the question is now, how do we implement that research into our daily lives? And how do we make the research relevant? I think in the past, the research has been irrelevant, or the research hasn't reached the people. And so we need to look at the research, make it relevant and to the current contemporary concerns that we have, and apply it. I don't think it's a question of the lack of research. I think the question is like, it goes back to my earlier question, how much do we actually want to change? And unfortunately for most of us, the primary motivator is economic development, right? I mean, that's why we go to school. That's why we go to college. That's why we get a job, and the spiritual pursuit is important to us. And it may guide us in so many ways, but at the end of the day, we need to put food on our table. And because the economic model is so environmentally destructive, it's very hard to swim against that grain of a system which is opposed to living in balance and harmony with the world. And so it requires like a personal desire to shift things in a very significant ways. It's like Gandhi said, I know someone's mentioning here about Gandhi's International Day of Nonviolence. I actually think October 2nd is some kind of International Day for Nonviolence. You can look into that. But as Gandhi once said, he said, my friends joke that it's very expensive for them to keep me poor. It's expensive for his friends to keep Gandhi poor. And what he meant by that is that it's difficult to live against the grain of mainstream society. It's very difficult. If we want to be a poor person, it's actually not very easy. It's actually quite expensive to do. So I think the research is there. We have to make that personal conviction to actually implement it in our own lives.
So would you like to take one more question, sir?
I'm here as long as you need me.
Okay. So thank you for your kindness. It was daunting fact revealed about arrival of Columbus and Doctrine of Discovery as other historical event identified as root of crisis. On RAM is such a revealing perspective as solution to complex problems. So I think it is not a question, it's a praise for the presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Aditi, for that. And I think, again, the reason I shared it is because it's important to know the cultural context for why we have these systems in place. This understanding that man and nature are separate, which underpins modern society, not just in the West, but also in India, in Indian government and business and finance, is not arbitrary. It came from a very specific theological understanding out of Christianity. And I'm not criticizing Christianity here, but I'm just saying there was a certain moment in time where Christianity separated people and nature. And because of that separation, that led to people then being able to exploit the natural world, right? And so if we can understand the cultural theological roots of our so-called secular society, then we can understand how we can actually start reforming them. And even the idea of a secular society, there's a book by a British historian called Tom Holland. He wrote a book called Dominion a couple of years ago, and he's a Christian and he's a historian, and he says even the idea of a secular country is a Christian idea. Just process that. The idea of a secular country is a Christian idea. Okay. And so we really need to examine these things in a very thoughtful, mature way. Like, what underpins what we consider to be a norm? We consider a secular country to be a norm, but actually that's a secular country is a very Christian idea, right? So these are the things we really need to like think about and kind of engage with from a Hindu Vaishnav perspective.
So one more suggestion is coming repeatedly. Can we do something to UN with UN to declare one day as a meat-free day, like they are suggesting October 2? So can it be done some way or the other? I mean, since you are also engaged with many UN consulting bodies.
Yeah, I mean, the way, I mean, I love that idea. The way these things work within the UN is that a country needs to propose an idea like that. So, for example, we have International Day of Yoga, I think in June or July. Obviously, that was proposed by India, and then the other countries supported the proposal. So, if we want an International Day of Vegetarianism or International Day of Plant-based diets, then I would suggest you lobby the Indian government to make that proposal to the United Nations. And then the Indian government can get other countries to support the proposal, and then that's how it will happen.
Thank you, sir.